Hello, everybody, and welcome to our virtual Read Aloud. I am so excited for today's conversation, today's guest, and what we're going to learn about. And so, as you're coming in, say hello, let us know you're there. This is an interactive time, so if you are watching now, you can in the comments leave a comment or leave a question, and we can definitely be able to answer it throughout this conversation. I had the pleasure to learn about the Pullman monument and about what Ranger Sarah does as far as with read alouds and just the work that's happening there. So today is really going to be an opportunity for us to learn about not only the work of a ranger, about the amazing things happening at the Pullman National Monument, but also about an amazing, amazing story that talks about the neighborhood of Pullman. So again, as you're coming in, say hello, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I see a few people saying hello, hello, hello. So welcome. Before we get into our story for today, we're actually going to learn about our special guest. So before we get started, I'd like to welcome Ranger Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am awesome. So, what I'm excited about is because one, at Burst into Books, we're about not only exposing our families to the amazing resources in the city, but
Mhm.
also the history that goes along with it. And our organization is rooted in Roseland, which is not far from Pullman. And so, when
Mhm.
I learned about the first one, the National Monument opened,
Mhm.
right, that was an amazing time. But then also learning about all of the rich history that goes with it. I believe that it's important that we have conversations and know what's in our own backyards. And so
Mhm.
I would love to hear just a little bit about your background. Like tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. I'm Ranger Sarah, and I live in Pullman. So I'm a park ranger for the Pullman National Monument, which means I give tours. I come up with fun programs for school field trips, and hang out at their visitor center at the clock tower. But I also live in the Pullman neighborhood. I'm originally from the area. I grew up
Mhm.
in Beecher, Illinois, which is a little bit south.
Okay.
And I used to be a teacher. So I taught high school English for a little while, and I taught English at the University of Illinois at Chicago before I became a park ranger. And I have a cat, and his name is Brian. And you might hear him meowing. He likes stories. So,
So that is, I'm a teacher by trade as well. I've
Mhm.
taught kindergarten, elementary, high school, primarily science and reading. But
Okay.
to hear you say you went from a teacher to a ranger, like what drew you to the profession?
That's such a good question. So I was still teaching at the time, and I noticed that Pullman National Monument was hiring seasonal rangers. So it was just being a
Mm,
ranger for the summer. And since I wasn't teaching in the summer, I thought, oh, this is a lot of the things that I do as a teacher. I explain history, and I
mm.
help people understand important concepts. And I thought this would be a really fun job. And so I started as a seasonal ranger in 2018 and came back a few times to be a seasonal ranger. And after I graduated, I was able to get a job as a permanent ranger. So,
Wow, that's
yeah.
awesome. So, living in the neighborhood, not only an educator, but saw this as a grand opportunity. And then we had the opening of the Pullman National Monument. So,
Hmm.
can you kind of share about the backwork of that and why is that so, important, especially with it being in your own neighborhood as well?
Yeah, yeah. So Pullman is famous for being a company town where they built Pullman rail cars that were supposed to be like hotel rooms on wheels. So this is before we had, cars, fancy cars to drive in, or even airplanes. This is where how people would get around the country. And so the town was built in 1880, and there was the factory for the to build the rail cars as well. Um, and in 2015, President Barack Obama designated it as a national monument.
Mm,
And so from that point, there was a lot of work that needed to be done to the original factory building at the clock tower and the grounds all around. That took several years. And so actually just this past Labor Day, we finally opened our new visitor center and museum, which is right on 111th Street. So the address is 610 East 111th Street. And if you are going on the train on the Metro line, you'll see that clock tower, or you'll see signs from the highway if you're driving. But we had a big grand opening on Labor Day weekend this past year, and we had lots of people come into our new museum, and now we're open 7 days a week from 9 to 5, and it's free for everybody to come through.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited because of many things. I'm born and raised from Chicago as well. I'm not from the Pullman area originally. I'm actually from Auburn Gresham. But
Okay.
I taught for a number of years in the Pullman area. I actually taught not too far from the monument at Butler College Prep. I
Oh,
taught
yeah.
there high school for 8 years. And when we started the school, our principal was very big about like history and neighborhood appreciation and just like where were we coming to teach. And so we actually did a lot of like learning the neighborhood and like meeting families. And this
Mm-hmm.
is the first time I actually heard about all the history of Pullman. And this
Yeah.
is someone living in Chicago my entire life. I had no clue that less than 10 minutes from where I live was this rich history. And so we even went and traveled and um, like it felt like a field trip, from our
Mm-hmm.
school over there. I'm like, I didn't even know this park was over here or this or
Mm-hmm.
that. And then our high school is right across from the museum. So we were able to go into the Pullman Museum. And so I
Yeah.
think it's just so important. And I would love for us to speak to that. Like you can live in a city, it's not as if, this history is somewhat hidden, but because I just wasn't taught this in school, it was so important for me as an adult that I want to let as many families and kids know before you're in your 30s like me and you're
Absolutely.
learning about
Yeah.
Pullman, right?
Yeah, and we get a lot of people who come through who are from Chicago,
Yeah.
even people who live right in this area, and they maybe saw the clock tower and had no idea what it was, and they come in and they are just amazed at the amount of history, and really important history
Yes.
that is attached to Pullman. One of the big things that the Pullman story is connected to is a strike in 1894 that lasted for 2 months. It was the factory workers going on strike. So all the people in the company would often live in the neighborhood. They weren't required to live in the neighborhood, but many of them did. And during a recession in 1893, Pullman reduced the wages and hours of his workers, but he didn't reduce the rent for the homes that the Pullman Company owned. So this caused this big strike, and that turned into a boycott of Pullman trains that went all over the country. And the resolution of that strike actually led to the establishment of Labor Day as a national holiday. So we have, we can sort of say we're at the birthplace of Labor Day here in Chicago. And then the other big thing, which is part of the story that we'll read today, is the Porters, the story of the Porters.
Yes.
They didn't live in the neighborhood, but they worked on those trains, and they were one of the reasons that the Pullman car ride was such a luxurious experience. They formed their own union in 1925, and it took them a long time to get a contract with the company. It took 12 years, but they are considered to be extremely influential in the civil rights movement and the Great Migration. They're a really important group of people.
I love it. And so,
Yeah.
as you all heard, today's conversation is yes about the neighborhood, about the history, just about ourselves, but really about learning about such a rich history in Pullman. And so, today, not just with our conversation are we going to learn, but we're also going to learn through a story. We have a live book reading that Ranger Sarah is going to read, and it's about the Pullman Porters. And at the end, we will both talk about like some of the takeaways that we would love for our viewers and for you to take as well. As you're listening, if something sticks out to you, I would love for you to put it in the comments and we can pull it up during our conversation. But at this time, we're going to have our live reading.
Okay, so the book that I chose to read today is called The Pullman Porter, An American Journey, and it's written by Vanita Oelschlager with illustrations by Mike Blanc. Who was the most important African American in the 100 years following the end of the Civil War in 1865? Hint: he was in more movies than any other African American actor. He helped start the Civil Rights Movement after World War II. His children and grandchildren became doctors, lawyers, preachers, teachers, and great national leaders. The answer: the Pullman Porter. Railroad trains were in use in the United States by the 1830s. By the end of the Civil War, trains were carrying Americans from Boston, New York, west to Chicago and St. Louis, and south to Denver, San Francisco, and Seattle. Travel was very uncomfortable. The trip was dirty and noisy. You had to sleep in your seat or on a hard bunk bed stacked along the train wall. If you wanted to eat along the way, you had to bring your own food. A man from Chicago, George Pullman, saw an opportunity. He built the first fancy sleeping and dining railroad cars. He knew that wealthy travelers would pay more money to be served fine meals and sleep in beds with real mattresses and fine linens. The cars were warmed by an in-floor furnace and lit with candles. The Pullman sleeping car was invented in 1857. After the Civil War freed the slaves, George Pullman hired the best and brightest formerly enslaved to work in his Pullman train cars as porters. They had just been freed and needed jobs to provide for their families. The porter was part maid, shoeshine boy, nurse, and calmer of temper tantrums. He was the first person to greet passengers as they entered the station and the last to see them at the end of their trip. Porters carried a rule booklet in their pocket at all times. There were very specific ways a porter was to deal with situations as they arose. Here are 2 rules. To get rid of a fly, you need to darken the cabin and then leave one window open in the rear for the fly to escape. To wake a passenger, you are not to open his curtain, but to gently shake it and whisper the passenger's name. Sometimes, against the rules, the porter tossed food to hungry children as the train whisked by. The main task of the porters was to make the beds at night and turn them back into seats in the morning. The Pullman porter pulled down the beds and made them in 3 to 5 minutes. He made the beds when the passengers headed to the dining car for supper. If the bed wasn't made right, the passenger might fall out of the bed at night. The porter even cared for newborns and toddlers, sometimes in a separate car. Pullman maids sometimes held this job. Pullman porters catered to all the needs of the male as well as the female passengers. Most porters were between 5'7" and 6'1" in height. They were usually not younger than 25 or older than 40, but many of them lied about their ages to get jobs. The appearance of the Pullman porter had to be perfect. His fingernails were clean, his mustache was trimmed, and he wore a white coat to make the beds. He wore a black cap and blue jacket for greeting passengers and carrying their bags. Pullman porters had to provide their own shoe polish to shine people's shoes. They also had to buy their own uniforms and hats. A porter was often gone for long periods of time. Sometimes his family would not see him for weeks. You see that little girl's hugging her daddy, either because he's going away for a while or he just got home. Porters worked in pairs. Each pair took care of 2 cars. At night, one porter had to be awake at all times. They slept in 4-hour shifts. Their bed was a thin cushion covering a cramped couch in the smoking room. It was a hard way to work and sleep. The porter wasn't paid much by the hour. He relied on tips for much of his income. He earned tips by doing extra things for passengers, like shining shoes and caring for their children. It was said that Sarah Hines, wife of H.J. Hines, the ketchup maker, was the best tipper of all. Passengers often did not care to learn the names of the porters in their cars, so they would call them George instead, after George Pullman. This was embarrassing to a porter, but he had to accept it to keep his job and earn tips. That's not very nice, right? For someone to call you by someone else's name. The porter would look, listen, and learn from the passengers. He would read the papers they left behind, listen to them talk to one another, and learn all he could. The porter learned how important education was for children and took this message home to his family. By the 1920s, the Pullman porters had become a fixture on American trains. They worked 240 hours a month and sometimes only got $10 for it. In 1925, with the help of a very brave African American, A. Philip Randolph, they began to form a union for better pay and working conditions. But it wasn't until 1937 that Randolph and the porters finally got their union and they were able to get better wages and working conditions from George Pullman's company. It was called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And that guy with his arms up is A. Philip Randolph. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, helped the Brotherhood. They would listen to them and set up meetings for them to meet with other unions. Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, ran the Pullman Company after George Pullman died. He was helpful to the Brotherhood also. He was more pleasant to meet with than George Pullman had been. The Pullman Porters, headed by A. Philip Randolph, really can be credited with starting the civil rights movement. In 1956, there was the Montgomery bus boycott. A Pullman porter, E.D. Nixon, is credited with asking Rosa Parks to be the person who would refuse to move to the back of the bus with other African Americans. Soon after this, they wanted to march to Washington, D.C. to show that they wanted all the same rights as the white people. They needed a great leader. They visited church after church to find someone to lead them. When they visited Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, he agreed to lead their march for equal rights for all people. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people gathered between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. Rich and poor came. Black and white came. Jews and Christians came. They sang "We Shall Overcome," a labor song from the 1930s. A. Philip Randolph introduced Martin Luther King Jr. who had insisted on a nonviolent civil protest. King gave his speech that started like this: "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That day in 1963, A. Philip Randolph handed the reins over to Martin Luther King Jr. And you can hear my kitty cat. He likes that part of the story. By the late 1960s, African Americans preferred air travel to riding on trains. The century of service the Porters had done for millions of Americans was coming to an end. Pullman Porters had helped lead African Americans out of slavery. Because of their hard work, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were able to get better jobs, pursue an education, become part of the American dream. In 1969, man walked on the moon. A. Philip Randolph turned 80, and the Pullman Company stopped making rail cars. The trains went the way of the dinosaur. Airlines were the new way to travel. Pullman sleepers are now in museums. This book was written to help us remember the Pullman Porters and how important they were in our history. We owe them a large debt of gratitude because they helped make it possible for Americans to explore and settle the United States. The Pullman Porters are now part of history that has passed. It is good to remember them for their courageous struggle for equal rights, and because some of the most famous African Americans were the children or grandchildren of those great Americans. And that's the end of the story. And the last page has a list of some famous descendants of Pullman Porters: Whoopi Goldberg, Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, and even President Barack Obama's wife, Michelle Obama, was a descendant of a Pullman Porter. And that's the end of the story.
That is so awesome. Brian even gave us an appearance.
Yes.
In the comment I'm going to show you, Denise said, "Hey, kitty."
Yeah.
He's like, "Look, you're not going to read without me." I
That's
love it.
right.
Do you mind? Because I saw Whoopi Goldberg. Like, who are some of the people who are descendants of?
So, and this book says, Whoopi Goldberg, her grandfather was a Pullman Porter. Malcolm X, I think he himself was a Pullman Porter. It doesn't say in here. Thurgood Marshall, he and his father were both Pullman Porters.
Wow.
And then E.D. Nixon, who helped organize the Montgomery bus boycott. Yeah. And there are more. An early filmmaker whose name I can't remember right now was a Pullman Porter. Claude McKay, who is a Harlem Renaissance author. Yeah. He was a Pullman Porter, and he wrote about that in one of his novels. So yeah, a lot of really prominent African Americans were themselves Pullman Porters or came from Pullman Porter households, which is really cool. Yeah.
I agree. Denise said this is an awesome story. I'm probably going to add this to my classroom library. And the comment she just made, I want to pull up because that's what I was thinking as you were reading. Because our next part are like, what are takeaway lessons?
Yeah.
And she said, I wonder how close the Amtrak sleeping trains are designed to be like the Porter cars.
That's a really great question. I think the Pullman really set the standard for comfort in sleeper cars. And actually Amtrak built the last Pullman car. So even after the Pullman Company dissolved in 1968, the other rail companies were building Pullman cars. And so Amtrak was actually building Pullman cars all the way into the 1980s. So they're very, that model is definitely very close to the Pullman model. Maybe not quite as luxurious.
Yeah, but they were definitely right? I think the takeaway from me, and I would love to hear some of your takeaways, is just I'm always intrigued, like even for myself when I travel, right? Like when you
Mhm.
travel and you meet people, and it's even hearing the connection between the Great Migration, the boycotts, like all
Mhm.
these things. And I could just imagine the stories and people that the Pullman Porters met, you
Yeah.
know? And so
Yeah.
you traveling throughout these different cities and meeting people, and you're learning about injustices here and like rights over here, and like, wait, we
Mhm.
were just in this city, we were able to do this. And I could just see how it would fuel and it would encourage someone like a Thurgood Marshall to want to get in law, right? And it'll encourage like an E.D. Nixon to be like, no, we need to change it here because we just left Chicago and you can be on the bus and you can do
Mhm.
these things. And now we're in Mississippi in these different areas. And so I think the takeaway for me is that um these men, even though many, as you stated, may have not been like educated or were ex-slaves and all of that, they were able to use their experiences and stories to pour into their families, to
Mhm.
pour into their communities, where maybe their role, if they hadn't had it, wouldn't have sparked sparks in the next generation of people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that the Porters would do as they were traveling back and forth, especially when they were going north and south, they took the Chicago Defender, which was an African American
Yes,
newspaper,
yes,
and that the newspaper had, ads for jobs and articles about opportunity and how to travel safely, and they would secretly distribute that Defender to the folks in the South who wouldn't have access to it.
mm,
And so they were really, the way that they created this network of people and helped, their fellow African Americans to find opportunity is a really cool story. I think my takeaway has a lot to do with, the Porters in their time were people that, the passengers on the Pullman cars would think aren't terribly important, right?
mm,
And they probably wouldn't be thinking, oh, there's going to be books written about these folks or a museum dedicated to the Pullman story and the Pullman Porter story. And so the lesson that I get is that, even people that maybe we think aren't doing the big important things, they're not president, they're not inventing new things, those people are also really important to
yep.
history, and they may be doing things that you might not realize are important now but have a big impact later.
I love that. I
Yeah,
love it. And comments are saying this is good. I didn't know this. This is awesome. So
that's great.
the purpose of this conversation, you all, was yes for us to learn about Ranger Sarah and just what intrigued her to this role, but for us to learn about all the cool things in our own back doors, right? That we didn't even know was possible. And as I know, many CPS students are on spring break this upcoming week, and some are like at the end of their break. I want us to know that we always have opportunities to visit monuments and museums and things in our own backyard. I know that the Pullman Museum, which was already stated, is temporarily closed, but I
Yep.
know it's because of renovations and things that they're expanding. So
Hmm.
when it opens, it'll be bigger and better.
Yeah.
But we do still have some stuff that is available to learn about Pullman. So my next thing is, what's next? What can people take away from this conversation of how they can learn more, and what's in store at the Pullman National Monument?
Yeah. So our visitor center, like I said earlier, is at that clock tower building. We have a museum. You can see a kind of replica of a Pullman train, and see a real Pullman uniform hat, and some other materials about the town and everything like that. We're open 7 days a week, 9 to 5, and it's entrance free. For kids of all ages, we have a junior ranger program. So this is a little activity book, and that's the clock tower. If you're not sure, I've been talking about that a lot. That's what it looks like. And so there are, different activities that take you through some of the Pullman story. And you can complete this activity book, and then you're officially inducted as a junior ranger, and you get a badge
Oh,
that says
wow.
Pullman on it. This is a program that is across the National Park Service. So you can start at Pullman and get a Pullman badge and then go to other national park sites, so like Indiana Dunes, which is also nearby. You can get a badge there as well. And then we also have National Park Week coming up. And I
Yeah.
know I sent you our flyer of all kinds of programs. So it starts the 16th. And we'll start with a little bit of yoga on the factory grounds at 10 a.m. And then we have a bunch of other activities. So, things that are really good for families. April is a National Poetry Month, so we'll have something in our exhibits that you can create a Pullman haiku, which is just a little short 3-line poem. We have a little scavenger hunt for all of our accessibility features for folks with low mobility and low vision. On Wednesday, you can learn how to become a park ranger just like me. If you want to get started on that, we'll have a little Pullman dig. We'll have a sandbox outside. Hopefully the weather will be nice. And you can come and dig for Pullman artifacts. We'll have a seed giveaway. We have a big cleanup on that next Saturday, the 23rd. And then we finish with a little evening program on the 24th. We'll have a jazz band playing on the factory grounds and a fire pit. And we'll tell some Pullman stories, which will be a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. A
Yeah.
question was, what's the address? I know it's on here, but it's kind of small. Can you say the address to the monument again?
Yeah, so it's at 610 East 111th Street. So it's right off of 111th Street and Cottage Grove Avenue, if you're familiar with the area, and right off of the Bishop Ford Expressway.
Awesome. And I'm putting it in our comments as well. So if people watch this later, they're able to get that info. But again, all of these are coming up in the upcoming week. It's some amazing, amazing events. I'm definitely going to make my way that way with my son. I heard next week the weather is supposed to be a little bit warmer.
Yeah.
So hopefully it'll hold up for these other things as well. So before we end out, I just wanted to say this has been an amazing, amazing time, Ranger Sarah. I look forward to continuing to stay connected with you. As I've stated, our building in Roseland is right down the street from the monument. So
Yep.
I look forward to in the summer bringing our kids over and just finding ways we can continue to work together. But I really thought that this was an amazing conversation for people to learn, one, about the Pullman National Monument, secondly, about the Pullman Porters. And my hope is that, and for me, because I love to research, you said names that all of them, I was like, hey, Philip Randolph. Yeah, he was, and it sparks you to want to learn more about other people. And it's like how this one, as you say, a period of time that might have seemed insignificant to some, sparked so many other appointments. Like I didn't know anything about Labor Day, right? We enjoy working on Labor Day, but we didn't know what it took for individuals who had to work these long hours to fight for that even luxury. So
right. And that'll be the next big event that we have. We always have a big thing Labor Day weekend. So if you miss things on National Park Week, come back for Labor Day too. And real quickly, for grown-ups who want to learn more about the Porters, there are a couple of other good books. Rising from the Rails by Larry Ty is a really good history of the Pullman Porters. And if you want to hear firsthand accounts, Miles of Smiles, Years of Struggle has firsthand accounts from folks who were Pullman Porters that were still living at the time that the book was published. So
I love it. We're going to definitely do a replay and make sure that we include those book titles along with what you read today, because I believe that as much as we want the younger generation, like I said, I didn't learn about it until I was an adult. And so I think it's important that their stories are still living and active. So I just want to say thank you so much. Can you say the names of the books one more time? I have Rising from the Rails, so I'm putting in the chat.
Rising from the Rails
Okay.
was one, and that's Larry Ty, if I can get my fingers out of the way. And
Okay.
then the other one is Miles of Smiles, Years of Struggle.
Miles of
And
Smiles.
that is Jack Santino.
Yeah.
And those are really good resources for learning more about the Pullman Porters.
And even that, and I think that's a good note, that title, Miles of Smiles, but Years of Struggle, right?
Mm-hmm,
Like being
mm-hmm.
able to know that they only have 4 hour shifts to sleep and they only really lived off their tips and having weeks without seeing their families, and just it just shows the amazing hearts of these gentlemen and just their determination to make sacrifices so their families could be provided for, but also that they understood the importance of me doing my job well, because like you said, one had to be awake, so I have to do my job well, because if not, it can hinder maybe my partner losing his job.
Right.
So
Right.
just the brotherhood in itself is just really, really powerful for me. So I think that they give an example in multiple ways of how we should care for one another.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I know this has been an awesome time for me. For those who are watching now, thank you for tuning in. For those who may catch the replay, again, I put at the bottom of the screen the website where you can go to learn more about the Pullman National Monument. Also at the bottom is how you can join Versatile Books mailing list, and you can always stay up to date when we have other talks like this. And again, I hope you're able to visit the monument soon during National Park. What is it called? Sorry.
National Park Week. Yeah.
National Park Week. I had it right. Hopefully you're able to make it during then. If not, they're open every day, and just being able to get your children and yourselves involved in the amazing things that's happening at the Park District. Yeah. Thank you. Have a great Saturday.
Thank you. I'll see you all soon.
Tell Brian bye for us too. All right. Bye.